Good morning, it's Dr. Calatrello. We've got a few slides to go through today that correspond with the chapter in your book, Figures of Speech. And again, these presentations aren't designed to be a substitute for your reading, but rather, hopefully they are enhancing your reading and maybe filling in some of the gaps and maybe answering some of the questions that you might have. The poem begins in delight and ends in wisdom. A famous quote from Robert Frost, probably the most popular poet in America during the 20th century. And one of the ways I think that the poet can achieve this in his poetry or her poetry. In other words, one of the techniques and strategies that the poet has is to rely on figures of speech, because indeed the figures of speech oftentimes are the delight or result in the delight that's created in the poem, and ultimately we could argue the figures of speech often lead to the wisdom that the poem imparts on the reader. Figurative language is language that cannot be taken literally or should not be taken literally only. It's a way of saying one thing in terms of something else. I thought a poem might be useful to illustrate the notion of figures of speech, and also might illuminate or illustrate the idea that we started this presentation with, the notion of Frost's that a poem should begin in delight and end in wisdom. To that end, I'm going to try to read for you Sign for My Father Who Stressed the Bunt by the Georgia poet David Bottoms. On the rough diamond, the hand-cut field between the dog lot and the barn, we rehearsed the strict technique of bunting. I watched from the infield, the mound, the backstop, as your left hand climbed the bat, your legs and shoulders squared toward the pitcher. You could drop it like a seed down either baseline. I admired your style, but not enough to take my eyes off the bank that served as our center field fence. Years passed, 3 leagues of organized ball, no few lives. I could homer into the garden beyond the bank, into the left field lot of Carmichael Motors, and still you stressed the same technique, the crouch and spring, the lead arm absorbing just enough impact, that whole tiresome pitch about basics never changing, and I never learned what you were laying down. Like the hand brushed across the bill of a cap, let this be the sign I'm getting a grip on the sacrifice. 2 very basic terms that you're probably already familiar with are simile and metaphor. Simile and metaphor are both used as a means of comparing things that are essentially unlike. Now, if you can recall, a simile is usually making a comparison between 2 things, and in that comparison the writer uses the words like or as. So in the poem that I just read by David Bottoms, A Sign from My Father Who Stressed the Bunt, when the poet and the speakers say the line, like the hand brushed upon the bill of a cap, this is a form of simile. This is a form of comparing 2 things that are essentially unlike, but somehow that comparison works. Okay, the speaker is comparing the sign of that a coach might use to signal a player, brushing his hand upon the bill of a cap. He's comparing that sign or that communication to the communication between father and son. That the son is understanding now, finally getting a grip on what he meant by sacrifice. Metaphor is a comparison that is not expressed but somehow created when the figurative term is substituted or identified with a literal term. Another easier way of thinking about it is that it's essentially the same as a simile, but the writer does not use the term like or as. Here's a simple example from the writer D.H. Lawrence, who writes, "My soul is a dark forest." This is a classic metaphor, okay? Because the writer is comparing his soul, something that is unknown, to something that is known, a dark forest. Two things that aren't typically thought of as being similar, but the use of figurative language brings and evokes a sense of understanding within the reader. We don't know what lurks inside the person's soul, but we have an idea about what a dark forest is like, right? It could be scary, it could be confusing, chaotic. And so the use of figurative language is a way of comparing things that are essentially unlike, but in doing so, the comparison seems fresh to the reader, and it appeals and delights our imagination and draws us in into the poem or into the story if it's being used in a piece of prose fiction. Two other terms to consider in our study of figurative language: personification and apostrophe. I particularly like personification, and personification occurs when a writer begins to attribute or begins to ascribe human qualities or human characteristics to an animal, to an object, or to some kind of abstract concept. So, for example, the car coughed as it made its way down the street. In this sentence, we see an example of personification because the writer is ascribing to a car something that is inanimate and non-human, a human-like quality, the ability to cough, right? So cars don't cough, human beings cough. So when we see examples of writers who are assigning human-like qualities to things that are essentially non-human, this is personification. Another example of figurative language, another type of figurative language, is the apostrophe. Very closely related to personification, but it is when the speaker of a poem addresses someone absent or someone dead or something non-human as if it were present and alive and could somehow reply to what is being said. So there are examples of apostrophe can be found in a variety of poems and poetry. Famous poets use this figure of speech to convey and emphasize unusual and vivid images. William Wordsworth, for example, will exclaim in a poem, "Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour," from his sonnet called Milton. And in doing so, in calling out to somebody who is not present, in this case the famous poet John Milton, this is an example of an apostrophe. So don't confuse this kind of apostrophe with the punctuation mark that we sometimes use to show a possession or to form a contraction. It's spelled the same way, but when we use the term apostrophe in poetry, what we're referring to is exactly this kind of calling out to somebody who is not present, someone who is not physically there, and the speaker is addressing somebody, or even a concept like, "Oh, death," right? "Oh, death, be not proud." This could be interpreted as an example of a form of apostrophe. Overstatement is essentially the same as hyperbole. In other words, it's an exaggeration, right? I could eat a horse. This is an example of overstatement or hyperbole. Again, it's figurative language because I can't literally eat a horse, but I'm using language in a figurative way to try to express or to communicate to somebody how hungry I am. The opposite of overstatement is understatement, and that's when the speaker is somehow saying less than he means. A classic example of understatement is the end of Robert Frost's poem Birches, when the speaker says, one could do worse than be a swinger of birches. That's a classic example of understatement, because if we've read the poem and we think about what the swinger of birches is able to accomplish, we realize that one could do a whole lot worse than be a swinger of birches. Paradox. This is a term you're probably familiar with, and maybe even so the second one, oxymoron. But a paradox is a statement that appears to contradict itself, but somehow it really makes sense. And oxymoron is when we put together two words, usually side by side, juxtaposed or positioned right next to one another. And in doing so, an effect is created for the reader. So you put two terms side by side that directly contradict one another, but somehow it makes sense. Oxymoron like icy hot, jumbo shrimp, there's a funny one, cruel kindness, right? So this is a example of oxymoron. Two words put side by side together, juxtaposed next to one another, and in doing so it creates an effect for the reader. Chances are you're already familiar with this first term, pun, which is a play on words. And it's a play on words that relies exclusively on the word having more than one meaning, or perhaps sounding like another word. So a pun from the poem that I read, when the speaker of that David Bottom's poem, Sign from My Father, the one about baseball, there's a line in there when the speaker states, that whole tiresome pitch about basics never changing. I've highlighted or bold-faced the word pitch here because this is an example of pun, right? Because the pun works in the following way. Of course, a pitch in baseball is absolutely central, right? I mean, that's part of playing the game. We have a pitcher who pitches the ball to the catcher. But this way, it's the pun is working because pitch also means something else too, almost like a sales pitch, right? And that's what the speaker is using as the pun. It works on the literal level of baseball. That whole tiresome pitch. Strike that. The pun is the literal meaning here is that he's talking about the pitch that his father gave him about how important it is to sacrifice oneself for the runner to advance the base runner. But the figurative aspect of the pun works in the way that we know that pitch means or is a term so closely associated with baseball. Okay. The following two terms are closely related. They both substitute a significant detail or quality of an experience for the experience itself. They're called synecdoche and metonymy. First, let's look at synecdoche. A synecdoche is when a writer uses a part of something, a part of the whole, to represent the whole. So here are some examples. A neighbor could be said to have a wagging tongue. In other words, the neighbor's a gossip. This is a synecdoche because the writer is using a part of the human anatomy, a wagging tongue, to represent the whole person, right? The person talks too much. The person's a gossip. The president said there would be no boots on the ground. Okay, another example of synecdoche because the writer is using just a part of the whole to represent the entirety. In this case, soldiers, right? The writer is using boots on the ground, just the boots, But we know, figuratively, this is suggesting he's referring to the infantry or to soldiers. Dr. Calatrello felt at home among the other graybeards at the concert. Old men, right? So, again, synecdoche, because the gray beard is just a part of an old person, but it's representing the whole. Okay, and again, this is figurative language. It's a way of creating meaning and helping communicate to readers what we're trying to say in an imaginative way, saying one thing by saying another. And poets use it all the time. Metonymy is related to synecdoche. It's when the writer uses something that's closely related to the thing actually meant. So, for example, if we read the sentence, "The suits were at a meeting," right? There were suits there, but suits are typically related to business people, office people. So it's a way of referring to the whole by simply referring to something that is closely associated with that thing. Let me give you a hand, right, with your homework. I'm not literally going to give you a hand. I'm not going to chop my hand off to you, but the hand is closely associated with the idea of help and assistance. So this is an example of metonymy. So again, you're probably most familiar with pun, synecdoche, and metonymy, closely related terms that you can see operating sometimes in poetry. So why do writers use figurative language? And maybe why do readers respond so favorably to figurative language? Good questions. Poets use figurative language or figures of speech in their poems to help them achieve and to help them communicate their meaning. And again, part of what makes it attractive to us who enjoy reading, particularly poetry, is that oftentimes a lot of the pleasure that we get out of the poem is derived from the way our imaginations are teased through these figures of speech, through the use of simile and metaphor and punning and personification, apostrophes, and so forth. Figures of speech oftentimes can add imagery into the verse, into the poetry. Can think of the poem I read about baseball. It's a poem about sacrifice. It's a poem about relationships between fathers and sons. But by using that figurative language so skillfully, the way David Bottoms does, we have all of those images of baseball. And the parallel works so beautifully between the concept of bunting in baseball, which is a selfless act, right? You purposely get yourself thrown out at first base to advance the lead runner. And that works so beautifully for the whole concept of fathers and sons and parents and their children. We sacrifice, don't we? For our children, to advance them, to see them shine, to see them go out in front of us and score. And the speaker in that poem, if you go back and listen to it again or you read it, when he was young, he didn't understand that. He wanted to swing for the fences, right? He wanted to hit home runs because he was young, he was a boy. And yet the father kept emphasizing the bunt, its sacrifice, its discipline, and its form, and so forth. And the poignancy, or even we could say the wisdom of that poem that comes at the end, is that at the end the speaker is older, and he's grown, and he's mature, and looking back, he realizes now what his father was teaching him. And the poem is really an expression of gratitude, isn't it? As he says, I'm, like the sign, like the hand being brushed upon the bill of the cap. This is a sign. I'm getting a grip on the sacrifice. Right? yeah, it can evoke that emotional intensity, the intensity again of the poem that we've used in this presentation as an example. Again, though, and this is important too. I've made this point before, but remember, there is a higher premium on words in a poem that the writer of prose fiction and novels does not get to enjoy. In other words, by using that effective pun, by using that effective apostrophe or personification or simile, it provides an economy, a compression, and a means of concentration. It allows the poet to say much more with fewer words. Okay, so it's a strategy and a technique that emphasizes poetic economy. So I hope you enjoy reading through some of the poems in this chapter, and as you read through them, keep an eye out for these figures of speech. See what you can identify. See if you can identify simile or metaphor, and put some on the discussion board. See if we can get some discussions going on which ones that you found particularly engaging or useful. I'll see you next time.